Let's talk about a topic that's very subtle. It can be very difficult to really grasp it, what it means for you personally. It took me many years, decades, to really begin to grasp this topic. And the reason why I'm saying this is that you have to have a little patience with yourself, but you also have to realize that once you do break through, this is going to be extremely liberating for you. And it's really going to accelerate your growth to another level. And the topic is about perception and perception filters. I have talked about it before, that you put a pair of colored glasses in front of your eyes and everything you see is colored by the glasses. But there's a lot more to this topic. So let's start with a relatively simple way to talk about this. We were all brought up with a incomplete view of what perception is. We were brought up to think that perception is a passive process. So you go outside, you're looking at a tree, and there are light rays that are bouncing off the tree, and those light rays are hitting the retina in your eye, and they give an accurate picture of the tree. It's like taking a photograph. Your eyes are like taking a photograph of the tree, so you see what's actually there. The picture doesn't lie. And this is, of course, I'm not disputing that when it comes to practical things, actual physical things that are out there. But what is important to understand on the spiritual path is that perception isn't just a matter of seeing something that's out there. Perception is also about how we look at life in general, how we look at ourselves, how we look at ideas, how we deal with ideas and concepts. So, for example, when you find a spiritual teaching and study that teaching, are you really seeing, metaphorically speaking, are you grasping the teaching as it is, or is your perception of the teaching somehow distorted? So let's start with a simple example to illustrate the difference between perception and perception. What the eyes actually see and what you see. Let's say that you go outside. It's a clear night. What are your eyes seeing? Well, they don't see anything because there's no stimuli, there's no light coming to the eyes. After some time, your eyes start detecting that there's stimuli, but it doesn't seem to come from any particular direction. It sort of comes from everywhere. Now the eyes are detecting this increasing stimuli. Then at one point there's a very concentrated area of stimuli that starts to appear. And it becomes brighter and brighter, and it moves overhead and to the side, and after a long time it disappears again, and now you're back to your eyes are detecting no stimuli. So this is what your eyes detected. They just detect stimuli, and they detect different colors and so forth, different frequencies of light, but they're just detecting light rays. Now, how would you describe that situation? I've described what your eyes detect, but how would you describe it? You would probably say, the sun rose in the east, moved across the sky, set in the west. This is how we have brought up to look at situations. So you see here that your eyes are perceiving only light rays. Your eyes don't name it. This is a sun, this is a sky, this is the earth, the sun is moving in the sky. Your eyes do not name this, do not say this. So what does the naming? Well, your mind does. Now you can take this one step further and say, okay, we've all been brought up to think this is a reasonable way to interpret what our eyes see. Sun rose in the east, moved across the sky, set in the west. But is it in accordance with reality? Is this the way things really are? In other words, is it the sun that's moving relative to us? Or are we moving relative to the sun? Well, when you think about it, you know very well that it's not the sun moving around the earth. The earth is spinning on its own axis. So you are moving on the surface of the earth, And that's why at some point the sun is hidden beneath the curvature of the earth. And when the earth actually moves, the earth doesn't move from east to west, it moves from west to east. When you are moving towards the sun, there comes a point where you can now see the sun. But the sun is standing still. But from your perspective, it's the sun that's moving. And that means we have interpreted what our eyes see in a specific way that is relative to us. That's why you had the belief 500 years ago, the sun is the center of the universe. That's how we experience everything. You experience from your particular viewpoint, your localized viewpoint, you are the center of your world. Everything revolves around you. I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying this is how we interpret what our senses tell us. I, of course, see myself as being the center of my world, and everything else is around me, relative to me. And that's the way it should be, but nevertheless, we can ask the question now. It's one thing to see a localized perspective, to see the world from my perspective. But it's another thing if there's something in my mind that's distorting what I see from this perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, that one example is the sun is moving relative to me, when in reality I am moving relative to the sun, but there are many others. So let's take another situation. I was taught in school, I don't know if you were taught something different, but I was taught. You're looking at a tree. There are light rays that are bouncing off the tree, hitting my eye, hitting the retina. And the retina then sends signals to the brain so that the brain is seeing what the eyes are seeing. Today we know a little bit more about this because we know that the retina in the eye is actually more like the sensor in a digital camera. It takes light rays and converts them into digital signals. Not necessarily exactly the same as a computer, but very similar process. Those signals are then sent by the optic nerve to the visual cortex in the brain, which is actually in the back of the head, not right where the eyes are. And then inside the brain, these visual signals are then assembled again and turned into a picture. But you have probably experienced yourself that you can have your digital camera, you take a picture of a sunset, then you import it into your computer, and then you have a piece of software that can adjust the picture. You can make it lighter or darker, you can change the colors, you can actually make the sunset purple if you want to. This of course doesn't mean that you have changed anything in the physical world, but you have changed what you see. So is it possible that between the eyes and the image that's displayed inside your mind, there are certain filters that distort the image? Take another example. There are many movies that show that here's a group of people that are going to break in and steal some valuable thing inside a secure location. But in order to get in there, they have to walk through a hallway, and there's a security camera, and there is a control room where there's guards that are watching the security camera. So they hack into the cable, they record the empty hallway, and then they feed that to the computer as a loop. So here's the security guys, they are looking at the monitors, they are seeing an empty hallway while the thieves are walking through the hallway. You think about another illustration of this. Most cities at busy intersections, they have traffic cameras. And they all feed back to a central location, a traffic control center, and it's a dark room. And here's a group of people sitting there monitoring the traffic. They don't see the actual traffic. They see what's displayed on the monitors. And if somebody, again, like what's actually done in some movies, record something and displays a distorted image, then how can they respond to the actual situation? They can only respond based on what they see. And this is your brain. Your brain is inside a dark room. It doesn't see anything. Your brain is not seeing anything. Your brain is only seeing what the computer of the whole apparatus is displaying. But now we have another question we can ask ourselves is, who's inside your brain watching the monitor? Who's inside the control room? Well, as I have described it here, there can other various ways to describe it, but as I've described it in these videos, there's a conscious self that's the core of your identity, core of who you are. So that's the you, that's the person who's sitting inside the dark control room. And you are reacting every situation that you encounter. You're not reacting based on the actual situation. You're reacting based on the image that's displayed on a monitor inside your mind. And part of that image, at least when we're talking about physical perception, is the brain. It is the eyes, the optical nerve, the visual cortex. So the brain and the nervous system are displaying a certain image. But as I described in the example with the sun moving across the sky, this is based on your senses and is inaccurate. So now we need to add to this that perception isn't just a matter of the brain and the eyes and the senses. Because what have I explained in the other videos, there are 4 levels of the human mind. There's the physical, the emotional, mental, and identity level. So when an impulse comes from you, let's say it's an idea, right? Not just a perception, but it's an idea. When an idea comes to you, the conscious self that's sitting inside the dark control room, it isn't just a matter of the brain and the nervous system. The idea has to pass through your emotional mind, the mental mind, and the identity mind. And what if there are filters in those 3 layers of the mind that distort the idea? That means that the conscious self, you're sitting in there in the dark control room, you have to make a decision how to respond to this, but you don't have an accurate picture that's displayed on the screen. You have a distorted picture. So you are responding to the situation, or you're responding to life in general, based on a distorted image. That's why you will see that most spiritual teachers, most spiritual teachings out there talk about coming to a point where you see reality as it really is. And what does that mean in the language I've been using here? Well, what is it that distorts your perception? It's all of these subconscious selves that you have in the emotional, mental, and identity minds. They're literally, it's like putting a colored filter in front of your perception. So as you gradually walk the spiritual path, you get rid of these selves, one at a time. And this means your perception becomes clear. I've said your intuition becomes better, but even your perception of the world, the way you look at the world, look at yourself, look at ideas, it becomes clear. It also ties in with what I said about your depersonalizing your life. So you can come to a point where you begin to see things as they really are. Your perception becomes much more accurate. Now, let's make this a little bit more concrete by looking at an example. And I'm not trying to single anybody out, but just to illustrate it. I was recently watching a video on YouTube, and you can find it by searching on Flat Earth and National Geographic. National Geographic made a video about this group of people who call themselves the Flat Earthers, because they believe that we have all been fooled into thinking the Earth is round, when it is in reality flat. Now, I described in another video that as a child I learned that this is actually what people believed 500 years ago, that the Earth was flat. And so there are now people after 500 years who are going back and saying, but they were right back then. They were right 500 years ago. We have been fooled into thinking the Earth is round. So in the video, it shows that, first it shows these Flat Earthers, they have a convention. And there's a particular person who is one of the leaders of the Flat Earth movement. and he's greeted by some of the other members of the movement, and you can see on his facial expression he feels very special, because they all look up to him, they all think he's a very smart guy, and he's told them the truth about the flat earth. So he feels very special when they adore him as they do and think he's right. Then they show another situation where there's a group of people who have said, let's just test this, let's see if we can demonstrate this. So they're at a lake in California that's perfectly calm. They have a little rubber boat, and they have created this big, like a sail on a rubber boat, which has horizontal stripes of different colors. And now the boat sails out over the lake in a straight line. And when it gets out to a certain distance, the bottom stripe disappears. It's no longer visible. When it moves further out, another stripe and another stripe. And then they show this person who's the leader of the flat earthers, he is seeing this with his own eyes, right? And of course the whatever you would say, I'm sure most people would interpret this situation that the reason why the stripes disappear is because the earth is curved, and when the boat moves far enough out, the bottom stripe is hidden beneath the curvature of the earth, because the light rays move in a straight line, at least on short distances. So, but he, of course, can't accept this. So you can see his facial expression changes. Now there's probably a part of his being who realizes there's something here, but he can't acknowledge it. He just ignores it, and then he launches into some talk about there's this grand conspiracy, and that's why they even created NASA. So all of the billions of dollars spent on space exploration really only have one purpose, is to hide the truth for us that the earth is flat. I'm paraphrasing, but nevertheless. So what I'm trying to say about this is that this shows you how powerful these subconscious selves can be in terms of distorting our perception. Because I have talked about in other videos how we go below the 48th level of consciousness, we go into this illusion that we are separate beings. And then we start using these pairs, the dualistic polarities, to create a certain worldview. And once we have created a certain worldview and accepted that this is real, we elevate it to the status of being absolute. In other words, it cannot be wrong. Our worldview cannot be wrong, but what's really in a deeper level behind this is, I can't be wrong. I have this worldview, I think it's the absolute truth. If it was proven wrong, I would be proven wrong, but I can't be proven wrong, because the separate self can't bear this, because it would then plunge from superiority to inferiority. And it can't deal with that, so it has to deny. It has to go into denial about its worldview being wrong. It could not possibly be wrong. And don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, right? I have talked about how free will is absolute. Free will must be allowed to outplay itself. And one aspect of free will is we have to be able to create for ourselves any experience of life, any life experience that we want. And we do this partly by creating this worldview. It's more than just a formal ideology or political philosophy, but a religion or political philosophy can be part of it. But we create this worldview, and then we elevate it to the status of infallibility, and then we say, I am right about this worldview. I cannot be wrong. And why? It's the compensation game. We are compensating for our own feeling of incompleteness by creating the outward appearance that we are superior, we have some superior status in this world. And again, this is perfectly fine. I talked about the earth being a reality simulator. We can have, the one experience we can have is an immersion experience. And if people are in the immersion phase, this is exactly what they do. They create a worldview, and then they create a very strong subconscious self says, this can't be wrong. I cannot be wrong. Nothing wrong with it. As far as I'm concerned, if people need to go from embodiment to embodiment over thousands of years to be in this state of mind and always be concerned or be convinced that it can't be right, I don't have a problem with it. But I'm a spiritual person, and I'm talking about the spiritual path. And the spiritual path is not about proving some outer world view right. It's about shedding the illusions that make up our perception filter, these separate selves, until we can see reality as it is. That's what the spiritual path is about. That's why I've talked about there's a period where you have to pull yourself about the collective consciousness. You have to pull yourself away from all of these ideologies, thought systems, worldviews that are out there. And in order to do that, you have to build this rocket, you have to build this vehicle. You see yourself as a spiritual person. But then there comes a point at the 96th level where it can't take you further, because what have you actually done in that process? You have created a certain perception filter based on a spiritual teaching and a spiritual view of life. And there comes a point where you have to start questioning that perception filter in order to go higher on the path. And if you are not willing to question your perception filter, you will not go higher. You will be stuck at this point. I have known quite a number of people who found a spiritual teaching. They decided, now I have the ultimate truth given in the spiritual teaching. And don't get me wrong here. It may very well be that they have a valid spiritual teaching. It may very well be. But do they see the teaching as it really is? Do they grasp what is actually being said by the spiritual teacher? Or do they see the spiritual teaching through their perception filter? And as I've now tried to explain, it's inevitable that when you find a spiritual teaching, you still have a perception filter. So there comes a point, you don't have to get rid of the teaching, you don't necessarily have to find another teaching, but you have to start questioning the way you look at the teaching, the way you interpret the teaching, how your subconscious selves are using the teaching to build their sense of being special or being superior or having the absolute truth. This can be very difficult. I've seen it be difficult for many people. It was very difficult for myself to go through it, because I had this, experience that I would come to a point where either I saw some inconsistencies in my worldview, or I found a spiritual teaching that I could see was clearly at a higher level than my worldview. But I always had this sense that, but there must be something that's real. It can't all be wrong. And it's not necessarily that it's all wrong, but as I've said, if you are seeing the world through this little peephole in the wall, what you are seeing may not be inaccurate, but it's not the full picture. So, the spiritual path is about eventually raising our consciousness to a point where we have the full picture. It's not distorted. We see the world as it really is. It's not limited. So this means what? It means we don't have to question everything at once, but we have to be willing to question everything. We have to be willing to question our perceptions one at a time. Question the subconscious selves, free ourselves from them. And that is how we make progress on the spiritual path. And this, when you have done this for a while, it leads to the beginning of a recognition that can be even more difficult. And I think the best way to illustrate it is, again, this with a reality simulator. So you have probably experienced it yourself, or you've seen people, you can put on these virtual reality goggles. And now what you are seeing inside is some environment displayed by the computer. And you know this is an artificially created environment. But it looks very real. To your eyes, it looks very real. I remember the first time I saw this was back in the 1990s. It was actually at a science museum in Seattle, Washington, where they had these very primitive reality goggles then, but they showed a child who had put on these goggles. And then there was a monitor or TV screen. It was not a 85-inch screen as we have today. It was a much smaller one, and the computer technology was much more primitive, so the image that was rendered by the computer was pixelated. But nevertheless, the monitor showed what the child who was wearing the goggles was seeing inside the goggles. And now he was moving on this open stage. And you could see how he was inside this dungeon. And there was a turn, and there was a twist, and something came out and attacked him. So he was making all of these movements that if you just looked at movements, made absolutely no sense, right? But if you looked at what he was seeing, then you can see, oh yeah, that's why he's moving that way. But of course, when you're seeing it from the outside, you know it's not a real, he's not in a dungeon, he's walking on an empty stage. And of course, when you put on reality, virtual reality goggles, you know what you're seeing inside the goggle isn't real. It's not a real world, it's a simulated world, right? But again, if you have been born with reality goggles, what frame of reference would you have for saying this isn't real? So this is our situation. We have been born inside a reality simulator. We have not put on glasses. Well, we have. But the virtual reality goggles we have put on is the physical body and the brain and the nervous system and our emotional, mental, and identity bodies. This is the virtual reality goggles that we are experiencing reality simulator Earth through. It's an immersive environment because we don't experience that we entered an environment and now we are seeing something different. No, we don't remember being outside the environment. We don't remember going in. So we think this is all there is, what we're seeing. So this is one aspect of the reality simulator. It's displaying an environment. But that's not the only aspect. The other aspect of the reality simulator is that we are experiencing that the environment is real. This is a real world. It has power over us. Most people on the planet, they would say, of course we live in a real world. I mean, knock on the wall, it's hard, it hurts my hand, I can feel it. Of course it's a real world. What are you talking about? That it's all perception. I'm not saying it's all perception actually. I'm just saying that what we experience inside the four levels of our mind, that is all perception. And the way we interpret it is all perception. So when you come, I've talked about these separate selves, right? And you can say that there are specific separate selves. I talked in the earlier videos about you were bullied as a child, you create a subconscious self to deal with that situation. But I've also said that there are layers of these separate selves. There are some that are more broad about our attitude to life, our approach to life. But if you follow these selves, they make up a pyramid. There's a pyramidal structure. And you get to selves that are more and more subtle, more difficult to see. But at the top of the pyramid is one self. And this is what some spiritual teachers call the ego or the separate self. And this self has one function: to make the environment displayed by the reality simulator seem real. So there are two aspects of a reality simulator. There's the simulation and there's reality. But the simulation can never be reality. It's a simulated world, right? If you are putting on a pair of virtual reality goggles, you're not believing that the world you're seeing inside is real. It's not a real world, you know this. But because you were born inside the reality simulator terror, you don't realize that. But so the simulation itself cannot be a real world. What makes it seem real when you're inside of it? It's that particular self. In other words, it's your perception. There is something in your mind that makes the world seem real, which means, among other things, that you think this world has power over you. You even think this world defines you. There are people in the world who believe we're just evolved monkeys. All of our thoughts, all of our feelings, it's just our brain, the firing of neurons in our brain. And the way that your neurons fire is just determined by your genetic makeup, which you have no influence over. It's actually determined by chance, a completely random process. This is what they sincerely believe. And to them, this seems real. Now, you can say, as I've had some people say, yeah, that's fine. But all of this nonsense you are talking about the spiritual path, that's just your perception too. And what have I said in these videos? You're walking from the 48th to the 96th level. You're building a spiritual sense of self. And that self is also a simulation. It's just all a sense that what you are seeing is real. But what have I also said? I've said that the real goal of the spiritual path is to go to higher and higher levels where we get rid of this self, we get rid of these subconscious selves, we go beyond our perception filter. And we realize that we are in a reality simulator, but there is something outside the simulator. And the more clear our perception is, the more we can experience that reality outside the simulator, and the more our perception, the way we look at the simulator, will change. So I've talked about the earth being a schoolroom. We can graduate. We can come to the point now we graduate first, we ascend to the spiritual realm, and we become ascended masters. Well, what does that mean? It essentially means you come to, as I've described, there's the 144th level of consciousness, the highest level of consciousness you can have on earth. And when you stand there, if you look at the concept of a spiral staircase, you're getting up. I met people who think that means you now know everything. Everything there is to know about life and the universe, you know at the 144th level. But that's not actually what happens. What happens is that as you are walking higher and higher on that spiral staircase, you are questioning your perception. And that means you shed an illusion. Well, what did the illusion do? It made you think that the way you looked at a particular issue was real. As I said, with the flat earthers, they're absolutely convinced that the earth really is flat and that their perception is correct. So as you walk the path, you are shedding more and more of these perceptions. And what does it mean? You come to the 144th level and you look at earth, and it suddenly hits you, none of this is real. My sense that there was anything real here, that there was anything that defined me or had power over me, was just my perception. And I'm not saying, be very, very clear about this, I'm not saying that you should have that perception right now. Because our perception should be corresponding to our level of consciousness. The reason why I'm saying it is that it was very helpful to me to understand that the spiritual path is about overcoming my perceptions of the world, not validating them, not having them validated even by a spiritual teaching. Again, we can go back to the fundamentalist Christians. Their sense of reality tells them that the Christian religion is real. And they, at least some of them, are thinking that at some point, next week, next year, next century, Jesus is going to come back in some manifestation in the sky that's undeniable. And therefore, Jesus will validate their perception. Their worldview will be ultimately validated when Jesus comes back. Scientific materialists believe that one day everybody will give up the illusion of religion or spirituality and realize that the materialists are right. We are nothing more than our brains. When I was young, I was studying at a university, and there was a group of Marxist people. This was back in the 70s. They were absolutely convinced that one day the Marxist revolution would be complete and the whole world would be a Marxist society. And again, this is fine. This is the experience people have. And again, you can say on the spiritual path, well, if there's a group of people that need to have the experience that because they have this spiritual teaching, because they have this enlightened guru, they are superior to not only all people on earth, but all other spiritual people on earth, because they have the highest spiritual teaching. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with them having an experience. All I'm saying is, again, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You cannot seek to validate your perception and at the same time rise to a higher level of the spiritual path. Because seeking to validate your perception means you must stay at the level of consciousness where the perception seems real. And how do you rise beyond that level of consciousness? By being willing to question your perception until the conscious self goes outside the separate self that makes the perception seem real. And now the conscious self sees, oh, that wasn't reality. That was just perception. It was just a mental image. I am not that way. I am more. I am more than that separate self. Then you have risen to the next level. And if you keep doing that, you will eventually reach the 144th level. And then you have the choice to walk through the exit door. And now you're done. You are ascended.